Hello, welcome back. This is part two of the podcast where we discuss the Russian-Ukraine war. Um, I'm Apurba,
I'm
Alex.
Alex.
Yeah. So I think we're going to start off with that first video footage of that one soldier crossing the border that was caught in that one now infamous camera footage.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I'll say to this day, May 2024. The first 3 months of the war was the most interesting part,
Yes.
simply from like military tactics and actual combat going on.
Mhm.
Because right now, in throughout the different periods of the war, you've kind of seen a kind of separation of the types of warfare going on. You
Mhm.
see rapid movements in certain locations, see grinding attritional fights in other locations, in other
Mhm.
situations. But in the initial wars, you saw everything.
Mhm.
For example, the main one is the push towards Kiev and the northern assault.
Mhm.
You saw mass armor columns advancing forward. You saw airborne operations. Was it air assault from the VDV onto the Hostomel airport?
Mhm.
And in the south and the east, you saw kind of the more, you could say, traditional combat,
Mhm.
kind of attritional heavy fighting, taking over those pre-existing, most or some, I guess,
Mhm.
of the pre-existing defenses from 2014.
Yeah, I think the entire war was like a dream come true for a lot of logisticians for many years.
Yeah,
Have felt sort of unappreciated, right? But we saw straight up that in this day and age, it's almost impossible to hide military buildup. Everybody from the BBC to the Washington Post to the New York Times reported on the buildup of the Russian military on the western flank of Russia. Very few people at the time knew that it would turn into the war that we know today. But I remember during that time, a lot of people were shocked when the first tanks started rolling across the border. Yes, it was crazy. I think one of the craziest footage was a Ka 52, part of that now infamous storming of Hostomel by the Russian VDB. I think an excellent way to put it is we overestimated Russia in the beginning because the infamous 3 days to Kiev,
yeah,
parroted by the Russian propaganda machine, to the war that it is now. Right? We've saw how Russia has continued to grow and evolve, and my fear is now we're starting to underestimate Russian capabilities. And I think the clearest picture of that is the way that the Ka-52 attack helicopter was used in the beginning days of the war. It was used as almost like a Leroy Jenkins
yeah,
video,
yeah.
like storm the airport,
Direct fire, I
direct
guess.
fire, like get in there,
Yeah.
shoot at anything that moves. And we saw how ineffective they were. Like they were shot down like flies.
Well, I
Right.
disagree. I won't say that it is ineffective. The issue is that it's a not a sustainable tactic. They were very effective in neutralizing Ukrainian positions around the Hostomel airport, but then as soon as they started facing like actual air defense,
Mm-hmm.
Ukrainian air defense capabilities, they got knocked out of the air
Well,
essentially,
yeah,
and they couldn't be used anymore. But for
but
that period of time where they were actually being used in direct action, they were very effective.
mm-hmm.
It's just that they couldn't be sustained.
But they evolved
Yeah,
because in the beginning they were used in the way that we were talking about, and in the mid course of the war they were used as almost like flying artillery, where they would come up to the front lines, angle the helicopter
yeah,
angle of attack
yeah.
up, fire off, and then go back, which
Pitch up attacks. Yeah,
one of those, right? And then the most effective use, which I've seen, is they started using the technique during the counteroffensive where they would stay below the horizon in order to avoid fire, fly up, use their night vision and camera capabilities to see incoming convoys that they would coordinate with smaller drones, fire off one of those Vihir missiles, I believe,
yeah.
take out a few, armor, trucks, whatever it is, and then fly back down during the horizon. That period, the Ka-52 is what stopped the counteroffensive. So that
Oh,
is how I see how the
we'll get
war going.
we'll get to
Yeah.
that.
But
Yeah,
yes.
I
Okay.
I'll say the K-52 really kind of proved two things. Is
Mm-hmm.
that first is that the Apache and Hellfire design
Mm-hmm.
was I guess I was saying peak. because the KJ-2 has issues because it needs to guide the missile in, the Vicar in. Meanwhile, the Apache has the fire and forget capabilities of the Hellfire. So Apache was kind of essentially built for this kind of combat, where you peek up over the horizon, fire a missile, and immediately duck down. The second thing is that air defense is very effective, and again, we'll get to it at a later point during this podcast. But the KJ-2 was only able to accomplish that when the Ukrainians pushed out of their air defense bubble, and this is a thing you saw and see a lot in the war, especially like FPV usage or drone usage.
Yes,
is those mainly occur in periods of time when both sides are using operating drones. Since that's when both sides turn off their jammers and EW and all that.
Speaking of jammers, when we talk about the absolute cluster that was the initial Russian invasion, right? Like the logistics things. The tanks did not have fuel. Soldiers did not have bullets. There was this now infamous 40-mile traffic jam on the way to Kiev where Russian units were picked apart by, anti-tank teams of, one or two people. The Russians managed to jam the Ukrainians, but they also jammed their own equipment.
Yeah.
Right? So it works, but...
there was a two-week period where they either were jamming everything in the air or jamming nothing whatsoever. And the main thing about the Russian invasion that I feel was overestimated was the Russian, I guess, perception of reality. I know I talked about this in the first podcast, but really there was no planning essentially whatsoever for the war, for the initial invasion. I mean, it was something at least, but it did not reflect reality, and that's what killed it, because you didn't have fuel, you didn't have ammunition, you didn't even have orders or plans. I mean, you had Russian units. Those are in plenty of videos, but I remember one Ukrainian was driving past. I think it was like a broken down or at a fuel BTR, and and the crew had to ask the Ukrainian for directions to where Kiev was, because they had no idea where they were, and you saw that repeat, all throughout the front.
Сломались, пацаны. Сломались. Можно оттащить на Россию обратно. А вы хоть знаете, куда вы едете? Куда?
Of the northern area, because no one knew what they were doing, and that's exactly what enabled Ukraine to pick them off with independent teams when with ATGM like Javelin and such. You had that's what allowed Bayraktar to wreak havoc on the columns, because they were just idle with no air defense or electronic warfare or anything, sitting ducks. But again, the interesting thing is at the same time you had actual fighting going on east, south, and in kind of limited fashion in around Kiev at the hospital airport. And say what you will about both sides, but say what you will about both sides now, but back then both sides fought very hard and very well for those positions east and south. If you want to go into that.
Yes, but also I want to mention that beyond the new innovations that enter the battlefield, such as drones or what have you not, a key component of Ukrainian resistance was the psychological component. And I bring that up because if we take out a similar conflict, the collapse of the Afghan government in the face of the Taliban, right?
Or the Iraqis.
The Afghan president fled the country almost immediately, right? And it caused a collapse. To this day, I think one of the main reasons that the Ukrainian resistance was so strong was, one, the Ukrainian people were never united as before. It was their finest hour. They were the Britons during the Blitz. Everyone came together. I saw old men, women, and children making sandbags to stop amphibious assault in Odessa.
Molotovs in Kiev.
Like Kiev's, like ordinary citizens were being handed rifles. People really were united into one people, one army. Regular, babushkas became scouts, looking out the window. I still remember to this day a Ukrainian soldier sending a video where highlighted by fire or light or wherever, he says, we'll be in the bushes, we'll be in the ground. You know what video I'm talking about? He's like, you will meet your death in Ukraine.
Запишу по-русски, чтобы было, блядь, понятнее. Шо, ребята, как дела? Шо, тиха украинская ночь, да, как говорил великий украинский писатель Гоголь? Все ли у вас хорошо, ребятки? Нравятся ли вам наши байрактары? Как вы думаете, что это над вами сейчас летает?
Morale was extremely high.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, and a huge part of the reason, is number two, Zelensky. Now, President Zelensky, regardless of how you feel about him, during the initial days of the war, I remember seeing his behavior and thinking, wow, that's a leader. He was on the front lines. He had every opportunity to flee the country and be safe, seek refuge. And, he said, no, we will take... There's this now famous video where he takes a video and he's like, here's the minister of whatever. He's the minister of here I am. We're in Kiev. I don't need a ride. I need ammunition.
Yeah.
That is the reason the Ukrainian state did not collapse, because they stood their ground.
Yeah. I mean, I guess they kind of overlook it a little bit, but yeah, I mean, as I said, the independent teams running around, that doesn't happen without a strong strong morale amongst the population, because as you said, in Afghanistan and Iraq, you had units who just really didn't care or weren't motivated enough.
They were competent.
You had competent units around, but
yeah,
there weren't enough of them, and they weren't motivated enough to operate independently. In Afghanistan, you had the Afghan commandos, who essentially were motivated, had morale, but they were few in number, and unfortunately, couldn't hold off the entire Taliban by themselves. But in Ukraine, it really was, as they say, the people themselves that defended Ukraine during those key moments. So that's the north, and east and south. I remember, especially when you saw all that craziness of going up north around Kiev and such. Everyone was questioning, what the hell was going on east and south. And then only after a couple of weeks that we started hearing news from it about all the heavy fighting going on. And I think a lot of that. I need to take a look at the map real quick. It's been such a long time. I know the big one that everyone remembers was Mariupol going on.
Yes.
Way, I think, was it
south of Tokmak?
Yeah, like 2 months ago. Yeah.
It's right over here.
Right there. Yeah. Mariupol was kind of the big moment of I think for me and for a lot of people, kind of realizing that the war, like that it was one of the moments that kind of indicated that both sides were committed to a proper war. Because you had Azov and all the other Ukrainian units just digging in, even while cut off and resisting, all the way to that steel plant. And you had Russia deciding to go all the way in there as well. Anything you want to elaborate on?
Just some technological innovations. We saw drones. They're ubiquitous now, but at the time, they were revolutionary. I mean, drones replaced so much. Formations used to have whole recon units, right? Whole vehicles that would go out. They'd use their cameras or binoculars. They would scout out the enemy and only see so much. You had a whole army geared towards reconnaissance, and all of that got replaced with a $200 Mavic drone that could just zoom up and fly over and see the enemy. Artillery, armies focus so much on making our artillery as accurate as possible using various computers, various strategies. And now it became a matter of flying a drone up and bracketing by literally seeing in real time where the shells landed. The hunter-killer drones, sci-fi stuff.
FPVs and such,
I don't need to get into it too much because we all know, you can either destroy your enemy after a concerted, combined arms effort, or you can fly a $200 drone drop a grenade right on someone who's sleeping, using the bathroom, is totally unaware, and fly away.
Yeah.
And if the drone gets shot down, it's a $200 drone.
Yep, with like a $55 grenade at most.
Right?
Up to
So
it.
we have like a drone dropping a grenade on a multi-million-dollar tank, right? A drone that is, destroying, entire platoons, and you're doing it at the cost of pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
Drones, I would say, like, if you had to say like one technological improvement, drones have changed the face of warfare.
Yeah. I guess the most apt comparison I would say is drones are essentially the biplanes of this modern day and age. It's a technology that has been realized as a kind of definitive thing of the future, but the development is starting to kick in now, and it's being developed, but it's not quite there yet for use, because I know there's been plenty of people saying, even especially on the front, that drones, while very useful and definitely demoralizing for the enemy and everyone involved, essentially, because it's a lot easier to be targeted as an individual now than it was, even 5 years ago.
Yep. I also want to say, at this stage in the war, this is the first time we see Russian forces face the reality of what it means to take over Ukraine. I mean, the Russians believed that they would be welcomed with flowers. The fact that there are like over 400,000-500,000 dead Russian soldiers means that they were greeted by something else.
No,
right?
no. It's not for. It's not the casualties. 450,000 casualties.
Yeah, casualties, right?
Big difference.
The Ukrainians were not willing to be a part of Russia. The Russians wanted to bring Ruski Mir, which is Russian world over. And while there were some people that wanted to join, they realized that the Ukrainians were not going to take this lying down, right? Like, from the Russian side, right, you had propaganda that showed tanks flying the Soviet flag, helicopters that had Na Berlin, which is like to Berlin, spray painted on the sides. Soldiers had their dress uniforms, it is said, as part of their equipment, because they expected to take Kiev so quickly.
There hasn't been any. I haven't seen any evidence from that.
Okay.
I've seen evidence of the riot shields and police units being in the front lines.
Okay.
Well, near the front.
Right.
But I guess I'll touch on it a bit later. But the thing I've seen a lot in the initial weeks was the information war going on, and how, I guess, effective it is to be to get your message across cheap. While doing it so cheaper than pretty much ever before. But again, we can get into that a bit later point.
Yep. So basically, they resisted, and the resistance is seen when the Ukrainians take back two big areas: one, Kherson, and two, the Kharkiv oblasts.
Yeah.
I remember the footage being, when the Ukrainians were liberating the towns. I saw footage of like the Ukrainian, people coming out with flowers. They were lining the streets. Sons were liberating their own towns. They were greeting their family members. In Kherson, I remember a soldier blasting the Ukrainian anthem, and everybody surrounded him. People were celebrating after the Russians crossed the bridge and left Kherson, and it was the closest that I've ever seen to the idea of liberation in this war.
Yeah.
The Russians were absolutely caught in the back foot. I mean, not only had they retreated in the early days of the war from the Kiev offensive, but now they're retreating in Kherson, the only major city that they had captured, and they were retreating from the Kharkiv oblasts. This seemed, tell me your thoughts, but like, what do you think about this being the time for Ukraine to either capitalize on the momentum that they had, or this being a good time to sue for peace? Was this an opportunity?
It's hard to tell, even in hindsight, because there's so much we don't know what happened on behind the scenes. But the issue is, I mean, it could have been a potential for a start for negotiations. But the problem is, negotiations were attempted several times before, and each time they flopped for whichever reason. I forget right now. But I feel even with some foresight, it wouldn't have led it to anything, because I guess you could, mainly because there was kind of no reason for either side to negotiate. Ukraine was running off of a kind of high of victory, rapid land gain.
Yes.
Especially kind of quickly and easily, because Russian forces were spread thin, and I guess I believe they weren't really. They still weren't structured properly. They were still kind of operating on initial invasion kind of procedures and such, minimal resistance and all that. And Ukraine just, thunder run all the way to the major cities. And, the Russians had to pull out. But I don't, I mean, I don't think it would have led to anything. It's just like with the counteroffensive. Before the counteroffensive, you could argue also again that there was a potential for negotiations to begin, but Ukraine was not going to do anything without doing the counteroffensive, which is not to be successful, and Russia certainly wasn't going to negotiate as they were going through a period of restructuring their forces.
Okay.
And I guess that's a good way into talking about how the big kind of stalemate period, slow grinding, with Bakhmut, Soledar, and the counteroffensive area in Zaporizhia direction.
So the counteroffensive, right? It was widely hyped. It came during the summer. As we know now, it maybe wasn't the most successful, taking back very little land at the cost of a lot of soldiers. What would you say? Why did the counteroffensive fail? Straight up,
Ukraine's about their own hype. I feel that's exactly, again, like I said, they came off. They had just essentially routed the Russian armed forces. From I think it was from like 40% of land gained of Ukrainian land held to like 25%. Massive swathes, and they bought into their own propaganda. The common talking point was that the Russians in the southern area would, man a Soviet line, were there unwillingly, were prepared to fight, and would flee at the first sign of any opposition. And especially at that time too, there was the influx of Western armor and equipment, and for whatever reason, they were overhyped to be as far superior than whatever Soviet era equipment was present in the field. And people just kind of ignored the reality of the war, where it doesn't matter kind of like how quality your equipment is or how trained your troops are when they're attacking hardened positions that have been built in for. I mean, the Soviet line was entrenched for 9 months,
right?
With 3 lines. It was manned with troops. It was prepared. It had mined, and for some reason that was kind of ignored, because people assumed that the Russians would abandon the positions.
I think it's more of the former, because you're right. Propaganda is important for both sides. And obviously, right, like you want to strike fear into the enemy while also boosting morale of your own side, right? So, of course, the Ukrainians did some of that. But I think it's also more of the second, where we have Western tanks that are fantastic and I do believe more advanced. However, mines don't care how advanced a tank is. The Surovikin line used heavy use of mines. It had anti-tank ditches. I think another reason is at this point the Russians start to shift, and they start moving towards total war economy. And what I mean by that is artillery. We thought artillery was a thing of the past, replaced by cruise missiles, replaced by these high-tech helicopters and whatnot. And it is this point when we start to realize that artillery is still king on the battlefield, right? Dropping munitions on people at a low cost per shot. trenches, right? Like you have all this high tech stuff, but the Surovikin line held, right? And I know in hindsight, a lot of news sources were sort of saying that instead of attacking along all points along the front, perhaps the Ukrainians should have just focused on one point, D-Day style, and just stormed down the middle and concentrated their forces. But in an alternate universe where they chose that path, perhaps that would have failed. And because they focused on one part, they would have lost other sections along the front.
Yeah.
So I think it is this point that the turning point starts to happen, slowly.
Kind of. I mean, I'll clarify a bit of my buying the hype thing. I also include kind of the whole hype of, I guess we say, mobile warfare, and also again that Western equipment being superior. In some ways it is, but the problem is kind of like you said, mine doesn't care what kind of tank rolls over. It's still a mine. A tank is still a tank, essentially. It's a box on wheels with a gun. It may have good armor, sure, but it's still going to get blown up by dedicated anti-tank, and it's there's a lot of talk, joking. I remember early on and before the war, even like you said, artillery is obsolete, trenches, who needs that? Everything's going to be fast and mobile, and again, everyone just kind of ignored the fact that a guy in a trench is hard to kill. A minefield is hard to cross. And it just, I kind of struggle to find words because I'm still kind of baffled by how poorly the counteroffensive went. Because like you kind of go through life with certain assumptions about how the world operates, and times I think sometimes the counteroffensive kind of proved them wrong. Like one of the ideas, kind of like you were saying, that whole mass in a location. If you just send enough vehicles or personnel on a single point, then the assumption is that you're gonna gate that point. Maybe at heavy casualties or such, maybe with minimal, depending on who you're talking to. But you're still gonna expect to take ground. But very little ground was taken with those massive assaults because they just got hit. I mean, we saw the infamous armor square,
Bradley Square.
Yeah, Bradley Square at that one junction and such. And I mean, it was just a mess. And I think it's just the Ukrainians fully. I mean, they made trailers for their counteroffensive. Going, don't talk about the offensive happening tomorrow. And we're gonna have a summer party in Crimea. It was advertised, and the big thing is that I believe Ukrainians fell for the big mistake of forgetting that the enemy can adapt to. And
the enemy has a vote.
Yeah, the enemy has a vote in what in your plans, and the Russians, voted really hard when they built those defenses and manned it, and the only explanation I have really for why the Ukrainians went full hog for 5 days was that they bought their own hype. And the turning point, I feel, is it was not even necessarily that first week of the counteroffensive. Was it the 4 months afterwards where they did the piecemeal attacks with like 5 AMRAPs or a platoon of guys every day, on and on and on and on. And they lost a lot of manpower, but it seems like morale as well, because after the counteroffensive was when we started seeing like morale issues among Ukrainian forces. Off the top of my head, I think was it the 111th, the 47th Marines, was it 3rd Brigade? I mean, I can't think but it seems, the counteroffensive was kind of the turning point. It was kind of where Ukrainians kind of, took a, kind of hit in their capabilities, and the Russians took a gain in theirs. One kind of the propaganda I saw from the Russian side was kind of like the whole, Yeah, and we were told that NATO armor was superior, that NATO was superior,
Mm-hmm.
and that was just kind of washed. The whole idea of Western equipment being better in the Russian view was kind of washed away with the counteroffensive, because you just saw piled up videos of Bradleys and Leopards and such, just wasted. And of all the issues, I think the counteroffensive is Ukraine's biggest flaw.
Okay. So after the counteroffensive, or around that same time, let's talk about Bakhmut.
Yeah.
Because I think that was also a very strong turning point in the war. What happened at Bakhmut that changed? Why did Russian fortunes change?
I would say it's really the kind of, again, shift away from Soviet style doctrine in a way, where you had a lot more independence in the units. And also, I forgot to say this with the counteroffensive, but it fits with Bakhmut as well. It's interesting that you kind of see a shift, I feel like, with Ukrainian and Russian doctrines. Ukraine seems to have kind of shifted more towards, I'd say, if I could word, Soviet-style doctrines, much more top down. While Russia has kind of gone for a more localized organization. We'll see in the end of which one's better for both sides.
Yeah.
But
sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, but I was gonna say because Bakhmut really kind of showed that it's with Prigozhin and Wagner, and how they kind of took the city. A lot more independent actions, small unit kind of tactics where squad leaders and platoon leaders had initiatives and were essentially leading the offensive going on in Bakhmut. And I think that's that, and the fact that you start seeing issues with Ukrainian artillery ammunition, and the kind of reintroduction of the Russian Air Force is what really kind of started the shift in how the war was going, and the loss of Bakhmut and Soledar.
Manpower advantages, I think, too, are a huge factor of why the momentum in the battle started to change. At the end of the day, Russia enjoys a 3-to-1 manpower advantage on Ukraine.
Is that true? I thought
about 40 million Ukrainians pre-war to about 150.
Oh, you mean populations?
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because on the front, it's been a fairly actually even balanced.
It is. I'm talking about overall.
Okay, yeah.
So that's important because it is said that typically you want a 3-to-1 ratio whenever you are assaulting a defensive position. Defenders always have the advantage.
Yeah.
What changed during Bakhmut is when it comes to urban warfare, it's pretty much a 1-per-1, right? Like it is urban warfare is famously deadly for both sides. And the issue is that Russia has a far greater depth of reserve when it comes to sheer bodies, especially since we saw, the use of convicts with, you mentioned Prigozhin, right?
Yeah.
So, this is a very interesting part of the war that I think deserves special, attention.
Yeah.
Just to start with Prigozhin himself, I mean, where to begin with this guy? I mean, just
from the start, I guess.
Yeah, from with this guy, I mean, this is a very interesting individual. Just to briefly summarize this individual, this is someone who, was in the Soviet prison system for a petty crime, got out of prison when the Soviet Union collapsed, allegedly sold hot dogs.
Yeah.
Eventually got into the restaurant business. Right, started off as a hot dog seller, restaurant business. Eventually, because of a famous restaurant he had in St. Petersburg, met Putin back in his early days, and you just slowly rose the ranks, winning army contracts, winning catering contracts. I think at some point, Russian forces needed a mercenary group. So that they could have an alibi, and Prigozhin.
Yeah, in Syria.
Yeah, in Syria and
Libya.
Africa, and Prigozhin was the perfect person to sort of field this shadowy organization. So we're talking about a hot dog seller that eventually became head of PMC Wagner. The musicians, so they call themselves, right? And we'll get to what happened later on, right? But at this point in the war, I mean, when I first started hearing about this guy, it was when Wagner forces captured Soledar, a small mining encampment on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Wagner captured Soledar, and then Bakhmut happens, right? We find a hot dog seller now at the forefront of what is the bloodiest war on the European continent since World War II. So, Wagner, like, who were they and what did they bring to the table?
Well, I mean, Wagner, I forget what they didn't start off as Wagner. Like you said, it was essentially a clandestine PMC branch in Syria. They're most known for in the West of being those guys who got blown to smithereens by the U.S. Army
after Syria. Yeah,
it was some Kurdish outpost or something,
right?
And Wagner attempted to attack with some Syrians, and they got absolutely blasted to smithereens. But yes, Wagner, in whatever form they were before, was essentially Russia's black ops arm in Middle East and Africa, and they got their name essentially by doing anti-terrorist, guerrilla, anti-civilian operations overseas. And in 2014, actually, they entered Ukraine as part of that little Green Man operation, to kind of be a little bit more hands off with I guess a little bit more separation between Russia and the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and all that. And in 2022, they also took part in the invasions, but yeah, it was the Soledar and Bakhmut where they really gained their infamy. And the history of them doing that kind of clandestine operations, it was really set them apart from the Russian armed forces, because Wagner developed independence from the RF, and with that and all that missions they did, kind of had a more focus on small scale actions. Again, you saw like individual commanders, doing their own thing essentially, as long as it was part of the general offensive, it was fine. It was entirely it's entirely different structure than how Russian armed forces had their structure set up at the time, and that also enabled them to do, I guess you could say, irregular strategy, such as hiring convicts for assault formations, and that irregularity combined with the distrust of Russian leaderships, meaning Shoigu, Gerasimov, combined with the desire for change, and combined with Wagner kind of gaining victories, while the Russians were kind of in a stalemate situation, is what I feel gained Prigozhin his fame and Wagner's fame as an organization.
Yeah, and attrition warfare was employed heavily during that period. Bakhmut was bloody. I mean, it really imitated Stalingrad in a lot of aspects, because buildings were taken block by block, street by street.
Yeah, I mean, Bakhmut was the definition of urban warfare. And as I like you said, urban hell, where you have one side on one floor, a second side on the second floor, the first side on the third floor, and fighting in the basements. I mean, complete madhouse. But it did serve as the kind of, I won't say but a defining point of the war. Bakhmut was more so a political victory than it was a military one, because you had both the Ukrainians and the Russians kind of make it it's kind of like Stalingrad, more so of a symbolic fight necessarily than I guess that's hard to say. I'd say Leningrad.
Okay.
Leningrad is much more fitting, more symbolic than it is practical.
Yep.
As a city.
Yep. Wagner is a lot more fluid. They provide competition with the regular army because they do things differently.
Yeah.
It's around this time we see one innovation that I remember was when it comes to calling for artillery. In the beginning, Russian forces were famously bad at it just because to call in an artillery strike, it is said that they had to go up several levels. And it is around this time that they shortened the process so much so that like on the ground commanders could seek out, call for, and then fire artillery without higher units approving it, which drastically improved the success rate of their strikes.
Yeah. It wasn't even that they had to go up the chain. It had to go up the chain and then down to the artillery. You had to send it back up and back down to the ground units.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's literally an app on phones.
Mm-hmm.
There's been videos of it where they literally just drop a pin down
mm-hmm.
saying, please, artillery strike here.
Mm-hmm.
And the artillery unit finds it, sees it, and hits it.
Mm-hmm.
So you went from, in some cases, like several hours before a position got hit to minutes.
Right.
Drastic change.
Right. And slowly but surely, Wagner starts to take Bakhmut. It's around this time that we see a lot of tension between the Ministry of Defense, Shoigu, Gerasimov, and Prigozhin. So what were some of the things that led to this? And we can talk about what it led to.
Oh, I mean, it mainly started because Wagner was independent from the Russian Federation. Mm-hmm. And I mean, around that time, you saw Donetsk and Luhansk essentially get stripped of their independence and get completely formed into the Russian Federation, and including their armed units. A lot of volunteer units also got folded up in that. And Wagner was essentially the only one that had maintained its independence and was proud and open about it too. And with Bakhmut and Soledar, you started seeing like kind of direct, declarations of look at Shoigu and his army, and they're doing nothing. Like we Wagner, we're doing taking cities, and it really was just that it looked bad for Shoigu and Gerasimov and all the other Russian leadership, and Wagner and Prigozhin just was a threat to their positions and their authority.
Yes.
And that's when you started seeing, the ammo being cut,
ammo video,
support being cut, and all this stuff. And, and that went on for a while and it started increasing in veracity as Wagner continued to get popular,
I think that's it.
Yeah,
he was a threat to Putin.
Yeah, not necessarily Putin, more Shoigu and Gerasimov, and the actual, Ministry of Defense, and you had Wagner recruiting stations, like you can't get more separate than having your own recruitment, your own logistics, your own. I mean, you even had essentially a Wagner Air Force flying around, so it was essentially a second army being built.
Yeah, and I'd like to make a parallel between history, like I'm no Roman historian, but I roughly know the story of Caesar, right?
Yeah.
Like he was off fighting the Gauls, and eventually he was ordered back home, right? And from what I understand of the story, he brought his armies, thought about it for a bit, and then decided, no, I'm not going to give up power to a bunch of people who sit in Rome while I spent the last few years fighting with my army in France. In fact, I'm going to cross the river Rubicon, cast the die and take Rome by storm. Yeah. And, it happened because the army, after fighting with him for a long time, was more loyal to Caesar than they were to the Romans in Rome, the Roman Senate in Rome. I started to see some of that happening, like Prigozhin at that time, not only was he was one of the few Russian leaders who were actively in the front. It was similar to what Zelensky did in the beginning stages of the war. You had Prigozhin post videos where you could see the bullets fly in the background. I mean, he was like, artillery was right next to him, like the soldiers would be like, the enemy, oh, where are they? 300 meters that way.
Yeah, there was video of him in Bakhmut one time where he literally met with an assault group right before they were about to attack, and the enemy was like, and the Ukrainians were 100 meters,
right,
tops, like a block away essentially. And
Поздравить всех парней, которые воюют.
То есть Артемовска.
А сколько здесь примерно в метрах?
400 метров. Да, противника, да.
Ну все, пойдем, а то наше поздравление будет последнее.
there was Prigozhin with his driver.
Yep.
Shaking hands and saying, good luck on your attack.
And the soldiers saw that. Not only did they see that he was actually on the front lines instead of someone like Putin, Gerasimov, or Shoigu, who are thousands of miles in the rear in Moscow, right? He was one of the few individuals who truly was talking openly about the war, right? What the most interesting period I saw was when he started having disagreements with the Ministry of Defense. Prigozhin posted a series of videos on his Telegram where he talked about the reasons the war started, the reality of how it was going. At this point, it was not going well for the Russians. And when all the other Russian opposition leaders were found with 2 bullets in the back of their head and a note saying, "Oh, it was suicide," he was someone
falling out of windows.
Yes, he was someone who was openly saying to the camera, "Hey, the Russian ministry is lying to you. This war is not going well. The reasons we're fighting this war were actually such, and such. And all of the oligarchs that support the war, their children are studying abroad in the West, and the people that are dying are ordinary Russians." And this was significant. Not only was he openly calling out the Russian state and indirectly Putin, although he was very careful not to ever name Putin directly, right?
That's the big one.
The second problem was he was winning.
Yeah.
He was right. And he was surrounded by a loyal army. There was nothing that the Russian state could do, right? It's one thing to remove so-and-so politician if he gets out of line, right? Here was Prigozhin, putting up flags in the center of Bakhmut in the bloodiest war, since World War II, right? And he was in a very strong position. And when he openly called out Shoigu and Gerasimov in that famous video,
Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?
Putin was between a rock and a hard place. Like on one hand, he has to support his own loyal stooges. On the other hand, Bakhmut were successful. Wagner was successful. They won over Bakhmut, and he has thousands of people. And now at this point, he has artillery, he has tanks, he has helicopters. It's a very, very sizable force that he can't just remove as if it was just one of his pawns. The pawn is now becoming an independent player. And this is when things start to get absolutely crazy.
Before we get to that, I want to use the bathroom real quick.
Okay.
Get a little too much water. And we're back.
Okay.
All right. So, getting into Prigozhin's march on Kiev. The big thing, from Prigozhin's claim, I kicked off the coup attempt was allegedly Russian Air Force by the direction of Shoigu that struck a Wagner camp, logistics camp or something like that, I forget. Yes. And I believe Prigozhin said that he had information that Shoigu was gathering his own, essentially loyalist forces. Then, and for whatever other reasons, Prigozhin decided the best course of action. Best course of action was to march on Moscow and then depose Shogun Gerasimov personally.
Yes. And he took that personally.
Yes. Prigozhin just decided to escalate things all the way to 100.
Yes.
By himself.
Yes.
And and I guess in Prigozhin's defense, it started off strong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was able to get to all the way to Rostov-on-Don
Mm-hmm.
without any resistance and take over the military base there,
Mm-hmm.
or military. I forget what it was. Command headquarters
Mm-hmm.
located there. Zero resistance.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately for him, issues kind of sprung up immediately, or at least in the first day.
Mm-hmm.
The two main ones was Surovikin's video, because Surovikin was Prigozhin's #1 supporter in the Ministry of Defense, and was essentially, Wagner's guy in the MOD. And he, voluntarily or not, debatable, unproven if he was forced to or not, made a video essentially denouncing the March on Moscow, or the Freedom March, I believe it was called, within Wagner.
March for Justice.
March for Justice
is how he framed it.
Yeah, March for Justice, that's the one.
Right.
Yeah. And the second issue is that none of the National Guard or Russian forces that he encountered, while they let him through with no resistance, none of them joined him. For the entire March for Justice, it was essentially the initial starting guys. And like you said earlier, with a reference to Caesar and his
crossing the Rubicon.
crossing the Rubicon with his legions, he was able to win because other legions joined him, and he gained active support for his efforts. Well, meanwhile, Prigozhin didn't.
Right. I mean, it's still shocking to this day how this hot dog seller was now leading a charge and thunder run to Moscow at the head of, at the time, one of the strongest military organizations on the planet. So like, this guy lived several lifetimes within this lifetime. I mean, as a fun fact, beyond being a crazy warlord, a business mogul, Putin's chef, and everything, he was also a children's illustrator at one point. So there's a really good Lenin quote where he says, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And in this case, it escalated from a disagreement between the Ministry of Defense and Prigozhin to him leading the most serious challenge to Vladimir Putin's decades-long hold on Russia overnight. I mean, we had a convoy, after capturing Rostov, we had a convoy literally make it to halfway across, Russia, Putin was allegedly said to have been either bunkering down or flying away. I mean, that's how serious the threat to his power was. And I agree. It stopped because he did not get the support that he thought he had. I still think to this day, we might never know. I mean, this might be one of those cases where the people who do know are dead, or they will never speak about it because of their role within it. We can only speculate. I personally think it's because, I think the Russian state threatened the lives of not just the commanders, but the families of the commanders as well, forcing Prigozhin to pull out, which to this day I think was his fatal move. I mean, once you come for the king, you best not miss. And he missed. He blinked, and that was just like the start of the end for Prigozhin.
I mean, Prigozhin's fate was sealed the moment he decided to revolt. I think what he did, though, and I feel more. I believe this more as time goes on because I kind of see it go into effect. Is Prigozhin decided to, Prigozhin, I'm certain knew that he was a dead man one way or another. Like his life was limited the second he stepped out. But I feel he stopped to save Wagner as an organization. And we see that especially today because Shoigu has been, not necessarily removed from power, but he had his position stopped. He got moved from his position. And and the Gerasimov also is rumored to be in threat today. So, no, I guess that, and also Wagner has not really been removed at all.
Mm-hmm.
Wagner's still not around as an independent faction anymore,
Mm-hmm.
but locally they're still the same forces in the same command structure. The Russian Africa Corps, and that's been assembled, is essentially Wagner in all but name.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they have much more. It is direct Russian, army
Mm-hmm.
there present, but personnel and commanders and officers are mostly Wagner still.
Right.
Like Wagner has not gone. In fact, it has in some ways thrived.
Right.
It's integrated now. It has actual authority now. And now we have Shoigu leaving. Instead of being removed from the military position, he was in for years.
Yeah.
And and all that. So it seems in some ways that Wagner has actually won the march for justice at the cost of its top leadership. In a way,
it's an odd situation. I mean, I was surprised at how long he survived.
Yeah.
I mean, he was alive for a few weeks after that.
I think it was 2 months.
Yeah, they obviously shot down the plane that killed him,
or had a bomb on board.
But it took a while. And in the meantime, I remember they raided his house and they found like various odd disguises. One of him, looking like Aladdin from the Dictator.
Yeah.
One where he looks like some celebrity with blonde fake hair,
like a hipster.
Yeah, a hipster, and it's so odd. But like, it's the end of someone who, of an evil dictator who lived a very interesting life, right?
I mean,
it's Progover.
It in any other circumstance, I mean, Prigozhin was essentially an Elder Scrolls main character. He was the head of multiple guilds. He had done countless quests.
He had side quests. Like the one where he, sold hot dogs. The one where he had a fishing, like a fishing boat restaurant.
Yeah.
And then the one where he was a catering guy. And then one where he was like a warlord in Africa. So he was a warlord. He did the whole Bakhmut thing, right? Like, and then afterwards, there was like a time period where he was in Africa back.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
it was so odd.
I mean, Prigozhin traveled the world and did everything he possibly could. I mean, again, he's a fantasy character,
And he died in, a spectacular fashion.
Yeah,
I mean, live by the sword, die by the sword.
He literally went out in a giant kaboom.
But yeah.
In a fiery explosion.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for the fact that he lived in the real world, he would have been a fictional character.
I know. I mean, I still can't get over the weird disguises that they found in his house. I mean. But anyway, so that's the end of the Prigozhin chapter. Okay, so to shift gears over, as of today, today is the 12th of May, 2024. The momentum of the war has shifted.
Yes.
And I think one of the key reasons is, once again, logistics. The Russian economy has shifted over to a war footing, and they are outproducing the Ukrainians in artillery, in tanks. They're producing FPV drones. All right. Due to some technical difficulties, i.e. ran out of storage on the second phone, we're back with a new and improved view. So we were just talking about, the end of Prigozhin, the end of the hot dog seller turned warlord turned revolutionary.
The main character.
Yeah, the main character who had side quests and not only designing, illustrating children's books, but also having various disguises, an Aladdin disguise, a Justin Bieber disguise, to having side quests in Africa, and then, living by the sword, dying by the sword, by, coming in, going out the way that he came in.
Massive fire explosion.
Kaboom. So, the reality of the war is won by manpower. It's won by sheer number of artillery shells that you can produce, the sheer amount of, tanks you can make. And, as of today, March 12th, we're seeing that the Russians have regained the initiative because they have shifted their economy, their society, and everything over to a war footing.
Yeah, pretty much. In all but name.
Yes.
With this war, we can see the ever-present reality of the fact that more stuff is better, and Russia's producing more drones, more tanks, more everything essentially than Ukraine is, and we're also seeing right after that, second role of logistics is important, and Ukraine can't really produce anything of its own at the moment. All their industries have been blown to smithereens or have been captured out east, and they're reliant on Western support, which is lacking. Right now, European artillery shipments not meeting their dates. We had 6 months of U.S. aid being stalled in the Congress and such, and the initiative is firmly in Russian hands, as we're seeing now with a new offensive in the north. We'll see what scale it goes on and how far it goes. And also we're still seeing action in the Avdiivka region, and we'll see what comes out of it. How do you think these offensives are going to go, and what do you think Ukraine's response will be?
I think the war is still very much open. It can go either way.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing Russia take advantage of its manpower, its industrial capacity to absolutely outproduce the Ukrainians. We're seeing a demographic collapse in Ukraine with a lot of young men fleeing the country. The Ukrainian government has started to increase the scope of its mobilization campaign to account for manpower shortages.
Yeah, they signed the mobilization bill not too long ago.
Yep. I think last time you said that this is Ukraine's war, or this is Russia's war
to lose. Yes.
And I think it really just depends at this point on who has more will to win.
Yes.
Ukrainians obviously have the will because this is their sovereignty that they're defending, but Ukrainians cannot do it alone, and they need support from outside parties. Russia, on the other hand, despite their recent gains, they are bleeding.
Yeah.
War costs a lot in blood and money, and they cannot keep it up forever. However, we're seeing now that the Russians are very, we've seen it in the last couple of years, but it's evident now they're all in. They're still not in control of Kiev, and they're not in control of
even
Kharkiv.
Kharkiv, Kherson, Odessa.
How I see it going is really who's going to commit, because if Russia, a population of approximately 150 million people commit, then it's very difficult to see a Ukrainian victory, even if we do give them all the financial support we need, because at the end of the day, right, it's bodies that win wars.
Yeah.
And I don't currently see, Western governments sending in troops. The Ukrainians on their side, right, they're dealing with manpower shortages. They're dealing with morale issues just because, this war is now turning into a long-term affair, right? For the Ukrainians, I think what's really important is them not just relying on Western support. They need to build their own industrial capacity. They need to start looking at, what I see as the Afghan defense. I don't know if I can find the interview now, but I remember seeing one a very long time ago of, an Afghan warlord saying, being absolutely assured that he was going to prevail. And roughly the message he was saying is how long are, foreign forces going to be here? 6 months, a year, 5 years, maybe 10, maybe 20. He said, we will be here for the next 1,000 years. We will never leave.
Yeah.
And the Ukrainians need that. They need to send a message that no matter how long it takes, we will never surrender. This is our home. This is our stand. And for every meter of land, you will bleed.
Yeah.
And their resolve simply needs to last longer than the resolves of the Russians. Yeah, that's how I see it.
But unfortunately, like you said, Ukraine can't fight this alone, and entered a period already. It seems like where everyone's starting to feel the pain.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, European reserves
Mm-hmm.
are dried up of military equipment.
Mm-hmm.
America is dealing with its own issues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you know, again, it took 6 months for the aid package to get passed.
Mm-hmm.
Even including Taiwan and Israel come on with it. And we've seen that this talk from and amongst Europeans of sending troops in. I know Germany recently made a statement about potentiality of NATO countries and our armies shooting down drones over Ukraine. France has discussed sending troops into Ukraine, but for the time being, that's all talk, and we'll see if they actually decide to go in. You know, like we know volunteers have gone in. A lot of Polish volunteers, French Foreign Legion, Americans, British, you know, all over the country have gone, all over the world have entered Ukraine to fight as volunteers, but nothing official yet. So we'll see. But you know, Ukraine supporters are trying to hurt monetarily. You know, a lot of money has been poured into Ukraine as combined with equipment. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing the commitment or resolve. Like for instance, I forget who did it, but there have been easing on oil sanctions for Russia by some, I think, European country.
Okay.
I forget. I saw in passing. And you know, again, for like the past 2 years, we know the Russians been bypassing oil sanctions through India, and no care has been taken to prevent that. And I'm not seeing the motive, the actual actions being taken by Europe or America to actually support Ukrainian commitment to fight. And even with the Ukrainians, there's still issues because, as you said, there's people fleeing the country and not staying and fighting for it. I mean, you have millions of people over outside of Ukraine who are, at this point, after the mobilization bill passed, cut off from services. I mean, it's going to be a rough year for Ukraine, I feel.
Yep, I agree. We shall see. I think that's a good stopping point. In the next final chapter, we'll talk about the future of the war and what it means for the world, especially when it comes to Ukraine.
Yeah, I guess to close out, what do you want to kind of as of this point, what do you see as lessons taken from this war that you feel needs to be kind of taken by people around the world?
The more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, like history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And, you know, a third platitude, right? Like war never changes except when it does. I think this war is just a recurring theme of like several lessons that we've already learned from history, in that it is the side that has more will always win over the side that has less. And that takes into account the realities of war. You know, like if your opponent is just as strongly willed as you are, you have to defeat your opponent and destroy them completely. That is the only way to counter such will. You have to either make him give up, or if they don't give up, then you have to destroy them. And we're seeing now that, you know, wars are won when soldiers hold ground and deny it to the enemy until their will is crushed completely. And I don't see any room for negotiations in the future anytime soon. Currently, neither the Ukrainian government or the Russian government want to negotiate, because they both see it as their war to win.
I mean, they have nothing to gain from negotiations at this point.
So I think the lesson is right now, I think we're entering the stage where it is realpolitik, or it goes beyond realpolitik. I think it is a battle. The battlefield is going to determine what will happen to the future of Ukraine. Not platitudes, not really, you know, the economy, not really propaganda, not really, you know, technology. It will be which side has more will.
Yeah.
That would be like the main lesson. How about yourself? What lesson would you say is a takeaway?
I'll say in the same vein is I'll say like yeah, that nothing really has changed. I mean, you know, for the past 10 years, I remember people saying, you know, like, oh, the war has changed, you know. Wars are a thing of the past. And no, they haven't been. They haven't been, and this proves that it isn't.
Yeah.
And I feel the lesson to be gained is, you know, essentially war's back on the table, you know.
War's back on the menu, boys.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much. I mean, you know, especially Europe. I mean, and even America. You know, it's been the goal of security rather than defense. And I feel, you know, is the best to learn now is, you know, war's back. Who knows what our next one will be? Who knows how big it will be? Who's going to be involved? But it's going to come somewhere, at some point, again and again. And really, I don't think it's ever going to go away, unfortunately.
Yep.
at least for the foreseeable future.
Yep.
War's back.
There's an old curse, and I think now it's true more than ever. It was especially true during the pandemic, but it was may you live to see interesting times.
Yeah.
And the times are
interesting and they look to be interesting.
Yep.
For here on out. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, and we'll see you guys next.
Yeah. Part 3.
Part 3.